Hello, everyone. I'm here with Kyle Morrison again. Kyle, how are you doing?
I've been well. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. Yeah, we're now, I feel like a lot has happened. The last time we talked was, I think, a couple weeks before Trump was inaugurated, and now we're a couple months into this second term. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, a lot has happened is definitely an understatement. In terms of my sort of initial thoughts, a lot of it is on par with what I was expecting. Some of it is a little worse. The immigration policies that Trump has been enacting, I had a feeling people would find those popular, but I am really shocked and concerned about sort of the blatant lack of regard for the court's rulings on some of those issues. I'd mentioned previously during our last conversation that Trump is operating now without anything to lose. He's not going to run for office again. This is his last go. So he doesn't really have the same pressure on him to end his term as popular as possible for the party. It's just that Trump just wants to accomplish what Trump wants to accomplish. So what that ends up looking like is a lot of the sort of blitzkrieg strategy that he has of policy, executive order, executive order, executive order, executive order has this impact of doing what Trump wants and then not worrying about the consequences. And if the courts challenge it, then the courts challenge it. But in the meantime, Trump just keeps going. He just keeps bulldozing through norms. I think the biggest shock for me, recapping sort of what happened, was the lack of outcry from the pardoning of January 6th individuals. The explanation I've sort of come up with is that I think most of the individuals who really cared about that were the individuals that have already distanced themselves from Trump. Again, I'm not sure that Trump is particularly popular right now. I just think that people like some of the results that they're seeing, but they still don't like Trump as the person.
I have been also struck by the muchness of this second term. It seems like a almost like a very conceited strategy, like you said, like a blitzkrieg to bombard people with more to make it almost difficult to process. And with the pardoning, I mean, as of now, that seems small compared to some of the other big issues. It is significant, but it's a more of a almost a cultural or symbolic significance rather than what are the material reality for people in the US, around the world. He definitely does seem to be ruling as if he has nothing to lose. And maybe ruling is the right word because he's almost trying to rule. That's the right way to put it.
It's interesting, I think, that you mentioned this idea of cultural significance because reflecting back on the election in 2024, I think the Democratic Party again tried to go about a strategy of the American people will vote in accordance with preserving the democratic traditions of the country. Will vote in seeing Trump as a threat to this common good. Will see Trump as a threat to those norms. And that worked to some degree, I think, in 2020. But I think in 2024, that message really fell short. And I think the failure from the Democratic Party to address the economic concerns of predominantly the working class individuals. And I think that the idea that vote for Democratic Party because we are the party that will preserve this became, for some, just lip service because they hadn't done this, and for others, a much lower priority than being able to afford eggs. And so Trump is, I think, has come to realize this, and I think that he's realized that he can do whatever he wants, he can say whatever he wants, and as long as he's able to distract, as long as he's able to divert, as long as he's able to do something that makes his base happy or give them a reason to continue liking him, people are going to keep supporting him because they are able to say, yeah, but I like what he's doing with this. And I like what he's doing with that. And I like that. And I think that's kind of what he's narrowed in on.
It does seem like he hasn't lost his base for the most part, and it doesn't really look like he will anytime soon, pretty much no matter what he does. But it does seem like you hinted at this, that at the time in 2024, the biggest concern were more tangible things like the cost of eggs. Arguably, with Trump's economic policies are threatening the cost of eggs. What do you think about that? And is that the limit where there starts to be pushback, or what do you think?
So this is where it gets a little interesting because for the average person, including myself, who has many years of schooling under my belt, I barely understand what tariffs are. So the majority of Americans don't understand what a tariff is. And that's not anyone's fault. Unless you go and take some courses in economics or do a degree in economics, you're not going to understand the impact of tariffs. And so when you have a big charismatic person saying we're going to have these big, beautiful tariffs and they're going to create a big, beautiful economy. Trust me, it's not going to be immediate. Just, wait a little bit. For the individual that's already started to sip the Kool-Aid, as it were, that's not an inconceivable stretch. Now, where I think things might change is we are going to have this conversation next year, 2 years from now, and things are still going to be really expensive, if not worse, as you mentioned, because tariffs do make things more expensive. Then I think people are going to start to get angry. And so I think when we come to the next election and things are still really, really expensive and things have not changed, I think we are going to see backlash, much like we saw backlash in 2020, where we saw this massive shift away from the Democratic Party because things were still expensive. And whoever's in power gets blamed for that usually. I've watched a few interviews where people are explained of how tariffs work, and will break it down and they'll sort of recognize it, and they have a moment where it clicks, but again, it sort of has to overcome that. Well, I refuse to admit that I'm wrong. I refuse to admit that I can't trust what Trump is saying. I'm curious to see what the long impact is. As horrible as it is for me to say, part of me almost is hoping that the economy just completely tanks, because it's almost this is what needs to happen to be able to have the I told you so moment, where someone's going to realize, oh, I've lost my retirement fund. I, can't afford gas. I can't afford eggs. Things have not gotten better. But I think people need to see that. And unless people see that for themselves, I don't know if they're going to believe it.
It's on some level, in aggregate, what the American people have asked for, even if it's very destructive. So it's inviting suffering in a very literal sense, but at the same time, it's people kind of getting what they want. So I could understand a bit of both. It's not what everyone wants, so there's going to be a lot of suffering that isn't asked for in that sense. At the same time, I mean, one thing in the back of my mind, a lot of the scholars I'll read that talk about the economy will say basically people vote on how the economy is doing in the month or two prior to the election. So if the economy is tanking now, hypothetically, that doesn't necessarily mean a year and a half from now, when everyone's voting, that they'll vote based off of that. So that also makes me a little curious how it'll all play out.
Yeah, there's this interesting phenomenon that we talk about in many areas of social sciences, social psychology, anthropology, sociology, you name it, of this idea of collective amnesia or selective amnesia, selective memory. And the idea that we select consciously or unconsciously, usually unconsciously, specific things that we remember. And by remembering, that means that we have to forget something. And so what ends up happening is we kind of forget that things happen the way they did and create this sort of construct in our mind of what the narrative actually is. And this is when we talk about why there's the stark difference between memory and history. There's no such thing as wrong memory, because anything that you say is your memory because you remember it that way. There is history, which is written a particular way. And we can get into a scholarly debate about that, but that's for a different time, different topic.
Yeah, different podcast.
Different podcast. But the idea of exactly what you're saying, everything that's happening now won't matter until, as you said, a few months before the election, because people will have forgotten it. Particularly now, I think this has been amplified by the 24-hour news cycle, where I think it used to be a little better, but now with our 24-hour news cycle, we are trained to now only really focus on the thing that has happened within the last 24, maybe 48 hours if we're lucky. And then we just move on. A topic is talked about and it's moved on, and once we've moved on, people don't really care. You'll find occasionally people have little sticking issues that I've formed a grudge because of this, but for the vast majority, I wholeheartedly agree that the months before the election are is how this dictates. If the economy is doing really well in the months before the election, then people are going to be happy about it, and they're going to forget if the economy was terrible all the way up until that point. That's what's happened with Trump, and I can provide a further example of that. I have a good friend, intelligent friend. She's finished her PhD, lives in Canada here with me, and she fully thought that the overturning of Roe v. Wade occurred as a result of what Biden did, because this phenomenon of things happen, things change, didn't really associate that, oh, it was the Supreme Court judges that Trump appointed that made the ruling during the Biden presidency. But because it happened during Biden's presidency, it's Biden's fault. And Biden was the one who did it. So it becomes that sort of association of and distancing of sort of cause and effect that I think people have. The economy is bad right now because of what Biden did, at least if you ask Trump. It comes a little harder to say that 4 years from now, though.
One thing I was very curious about your thoughts on the difference in messaging between Biden and Trump on, we'll say, on economic hardships more broadly. Because what you said before was, in the last interview, was that the messaging from the Biden administration, maybe from the Democrats in general, was very significant as well, even being basically told the economy is doing well when they feel like it's not, and that they're experiencing hardship. And it seems like people are either experiencing hardship or on a precipice or realizing they're about to experience hardship. What do you think is similar or different about Trump's messaging?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question. For Trump's messaging in contrast to Biden, here I'm going to dive into a little bit of my background in organizing and compare it that way. And organizing is this phenomenon called, when someone brings up an objection or something, we call it AAR, acknowledge, affirm, and redirect. So what Trump really does is he does that. And this is sort of the tried and true method of organizing, and we've seen it work, and we know it works. It's how we're trained. He says, so he acknowledges that, hey, your concern is valid. The economy is terrible. He affirms your belief that, yeah, this is really bad. I totally agree with you. And then he just redirects it. He doesn't give you a solution, but he just changes the topic. Biden, on the other hand, I think comes from what I think was the previous norm of politicians and the way that politics in general had worked for a while, in which he presented you with facts. And the fact, he may redirect you a little. He may, say, well, it's not as bad as you think, and it may be as bad as you think, but he's still going to present you with facts that, yeah, it's that, but, unemployment is down, or this price of this is down, and we've worked all of this, and we've done all of this. People have stopped listening after that first sentence. This is, I think, the frustration that the Democratic Party has, is people feel like they're being talked down to, and their concerns are not being heard. You go and you say, I cannot afford groceries, and you're told, yeah, but don't worry, we've worked really hard, and we've brought these prices down. That's great that you've brought those prices down. I still can't afford them. Trump, on the other hand, his messaging is very different. His is, yeah, it is really bad. You are 100% correct. You know what? Blame that person over there. I'm going to make it better. Don't worry about how. I'm going to make it better. Trust me. I know what I'm doing. And you know what? You can trust me because I'm telling you that you're right, and it's that guy's fault. And if someone comes up to me and says, hey, yeah, you're definitely right, don't worry, I'm probably going to believe them more or want to trust them more than someone who says, hey, I know what you're saying, I hear what you're saying, but actually, let me tell you what it really is. It becomes a very different message. Trump really is feeding into that populist rhetoric that makes him the sort of leader that he is that he never gives solutions, but he always, just gives this dismal message that everything is horrible and I'm going to fix it. And I think that was the primary message. And where Kamala Harris really fell short was, again, really trying to say, listen, things are not as bad as they seem. Don't worry. I know even if they are bad, we're going to make it better, but they're not so bad right now. And I don't think that message resonated, and I don't think it ever will. And I think this is the new brand of politics we have, where people don't really want facts. They just want to be heard, and they want the promise of something, but not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily need to have substance at this point.
I could see the distinction between these two and how different that messaging would play out. It seems like with the tariffs specifically and with some of the economic policies, it seems like Trump's message this term has overall been a message of we're going to experience some hardships now, but it'll be worth it in the long term. We need to make some adjustments. It's going to be worth it. It'll be beneficial in the long term. In your experience, how do you think that plays out? I mean, how have people been responding to that in your research, and has that been an example of kind of that more populist style, that, or is it closer to a Biden style as a type of dismissal?
This is a tough question to answer because it requires me to figure out how much credit to give Trump. If I'm giving him full credit and thinking that he's doing this consciously and that he's a brilliant strategist, I would say that what he's doing is brilliant in the sense that we just talked about how it was nothing that in the economy is really going to matter until right before the election. So if this is his plan of let's do tariff wars now, and I can get away with this and I can try to figure something out that benefits me or I can spin this message in a way that will help me or help, I guess, the Republican Party. I'm going to do it right now at the start of the presidency, and then we'll figure it out at the end. And, it won't, as I said, it won't really matter at that point. Anyone who knows anything about tariffs knows that it doesn't really help people. It doesn't really help lower costs. It's going to make things worse. Now, if we're still on the same line of, again, I'm going to preface this by I'm not an economist, so my knowledge of tariffs is limited. But on what I do know is that if his goal is to raise money in the federal government and to reduce the deficit, it's still going to hurt the average person. But yes, a tariff would collect additional income, allowing him to then proceed with his plan of slashing other budgets while also saying, well, see, the amount that we collected has balanced that out. I don't think that's going to work, and I think that anyone who's studied basic economics doesn't think that's going to work. But the majority of people have not studied basic economics.
Right.
So in terms of his strategy with the tariffs and what he's trying to do, I honestly don't know. I do think, though, this is where I'm sort of diving into the psychology of Trump. I think tariffs are a very effective tool that Trump has to push this narrative that he has pushed for years, that America is being treated so unfairly by foreign powers, by foreign governments, that we have been abused by other countries, and that everyone treats him so unfairly, and that he's this negotiator that's going to end this. And that is where I think the tariffs message that Trump is using is being most effective. Because listening to interviews with individuals who, when asked about the tariffs, that's what they are hearing. They're not hearing costs, they're not hearing money, they're not hearing that. They're hearing, well, this is going to renegotiate, and this is going to force countries to stop treating us so unfairly. It's going to bring back American jobs. It's going to force them to start doing work in the US. And it might do that. But at the end of the day, the toy that's being made in China, a company's going to have to do that way of which is more expensive, building a whole bunch of new factory plants in the United States and employing people where there's labor laws that have minimum wage. Is that really cheaper than just keeping the factory open and just raising prices on the product? And I think most of companies will not choose to bring jobs back. I don't think that's happening, but that's the message that she's able to sell.
Right. I do agree with you that it ultimately will not actually be beneficial from an economic perspective. In terms of the messaging, it is an interesting difference in message, and so I guess it's sellable. And I do agree with you both that Trump is probably, the two basic, as far as I can figure out, when scholars analyze Trump, some people have the brilliant strategist who's like 8 moves ahead, and then on the other side is much more of a chaotic, spur of the moment way of thinking. And I definitely agree with the second more. So,
Yeah, just adding to that, I think part of that, and this was something that I think we discussed before. I think that chaotic style works very well with what Trump does, which that with that blitzkrieg effect, as I said, where he just throws as much at the wall, and some of it will stick and some of it doesn't. But if 2 out of 10 policies work, then he's still able to say, "See, I did something," and the rest just kind of get lost in the clutter of everything that's going on. So I think it is the chaotic style of he just tries 15 different things at once, and one of them will have a result that he wants, and then he says, "See, I'm brilliant. I picked that one."
yeah, exactly. And then spinning the narrative in a very spur of the moment way in that process. And it does seem like what you're saying, that tariffs are a combination of what furthers his narrative of U.S. being a victim of other countries and something he can at least claim to be able to have control over as president. Whether that is real or not is actually currently legally up for dispute, but he could try to do it without trying to pass a law, which is going to be a lot harder to get through Congress. What do you think about this blitzkrieg approach?
I think that, I mean, again, I don't like to give him too much credit, but I think it's brilliant. I think it is, Trump comes from a background of TV personality. He knows how to catch people's attention, and that's exactly what he's doing. And I was thinking about this question a little bit earlier, and I almost liken it to the strategy of the British during World War II. So by the end of World War II, the British had turned pretty much every single agent that was sent from Germany over to Britain into double agents. So every German agent was working for the British by the end of the war. And the way that they kept Germany from knowing about this was this brilliant strategy of what they sort of call chicken feed, where they would throw an abundance of small, little, insignificant truths at German high command. And then mixed in with that would be big lies or big misinformations of, the invasion's on this day. Oh, it's actually not. But because there's been so much other truths that have come in, it kind of overshadows when you're wrong. And Trump does kind of something similar where, he executive order, throws this out, he does this, and then he does that, and he does this. And it's so hard to keep up that you kind of just get lost in this flurry, even to the point where he'll do things that contradict himself so often that you can say, yeah, but he said this, but then 2 days later it's like, oh no, but he said the opposite thing. So it's almost impossible to find an area to sort of nail him down. And it also, I think, one of the things that people have been so frustrated about is the lack of results they see. With Congress, I think that part of this push people said of cutting federal bureaucracy, cutting the federal government, reducing sort of that redundancy, the whole DOGE program, was the idea that they aren't seeing things happen. There's a committee that has to be struck to then decide if we're going to create 3 new subcommittees, and things move so slow in government that Trump addresses that as, it doesn't matter if they get overturned in court 3 days later or 3 weeks later or a month later. Trump is showing people results, and that's part of it with those tariffs as well as, here's 15 action items I've taken on to address the economy in the form of tariffs because I'm able to push that through really quickly. And then, again, he does something that some people don't like. The next day, he'll be doing 5 other things. And it becomes impossible to follow. And it becomes impossible to launch a counteroffense or a narrative or a counter campaign because there's not really singular issues you can campaign against. It just becomes overwhelming. It's like trying to research something or and just putting 3 words into Google. You'll get, couple billion results and have to sift through them and try to find something. There's just no way to feasibly do that.
It seems like one key aspect of the gridlock is also basically the building of different opinions. So like Currently, Republicans have both the White House and Senate and the House. And generally, when one party does that in the current era, they seem to have about 2 years before they get voted out of one or both of the houses. In terms of the normal process of passing legislation, they can pass one major piece of legislation. So for Obama, that was healthcare reform. You can go through each presidency and say this is the major piece of legislation. And that then immediately produces a type of backlash with people that oppose that, who then come together and form a coalition with the other party. And these might be groups of people that don't necessarily agree with each other. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, that they agree on not liking this last policy, and then they sweep in and take over. It seems like in response to this, that the major way that Trump has been trying to say, we're going to get stuff done, has been to try to significantly increase the power of the presidency. Is that fair? And what are your thoughts on all this?
Yeah, I think that 100% I agree with you on the increase in the power of the presidency. And I think this was something that we knew Trump was going to do before coming to office, and it was no secret. And I think that increasing the power of the presidency could be a really good thing. It's the same way of saying that dictatorship works really well if you have a benevolent dictator that does really good things for people. But unfortunately, we've never seen that happen. If you don't have any roadblocks, if you don't have any red tape to go through, you can get things done really quickly, and that's great. The problem is you need to make sure you're doing the things that people want you to do and are not harming other people. And I think what Trump has done is I'm going to go out on a limb and say that has permanently shifted the balance of power. And I think we're not going to go back to this idea of these single policies. Or rather, I'll correct myself and say, I don't think the Republican Party is going to. The Democratic Party, I don't think, has caught up with that and realized that. And I think that's part of their shortcomings, is that they have yet to acknowledge that traditional politics is gone. This idea that you can sort of work things out with reason, that you can push through these massive legacy bills, if you were, as they were mentioning. I don't think that's happening anymore. And I don't think that's what people really care about it anymore. I think people want to see things happen quickly. And I think part of that is also associated with our culture right now and the way we operate. When you go out to eat, you don't go and you don't spend a long time. You go to fast food, you want that right now. You log on your computer, send an email, you get that email in your inbox in a second. You don't write a letter and send it. No, we'll hear back in 2 weeks. We live in a world where we see results instantly. And so I think we are ingraining ourselves to become very impatient and to want to see results instantly. And I think that is translating to, when we see things moving really slowly, we get annoyed and we get frustrated. And Trump moves quickly. That's how he has lived his entire life. He moves quickly. He acts immediately. Act first, ask questions later. And I think that part of it plays very well into the creation of this new Trump regime. And I would hesitate to call it authoritarian, but it's authoritarian-esque. If we go down the list of things that we usually think about when we talk about authoritarianism, things like a lack of guiding ideology, check. Trump will flip-flop back and forth. There's not like a clear ideology. There's no overarching guide. Concentration of power, check. Trump, the Supreme Court ruling has said that Trump's absolved from all actions while he's in office, or the president is absolved. And we're cutting agencies and bulldozing norms, firing heads of agencies so that the president can do more and more and more. Restriction of individual rights, check. Whether it be something as small as putting up additional barriers for voting registration, deporting individuals. It's going down that list of, we think about the rise of Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany didn't start with rounding people up and sending them off to death camps. It started with very small little actions, closing shops, curfews, things that no one really cared or noticed about. And this is the same for every authoritarian regime from the beginning of history. You don't start with the full actions, you start with very small things that people don't love but are not going to take up arms and storm the government over. They're going to be like, oh, well, I don't really love this, but it doesn't affect me directly, so I'm okay. And, the suppression of dissent, the biggest one. Anything that criticizes Trump is being censored. Things are being removed that have a critique of Trump. I think there was a TV broadcast was recently cut because it criticized Trump. So we're starting to check the boxes of what sort of we characterize as authoritarian. And I'm not quite in full panic mode yet, but I'm starting to get there.